This is it, folks. We're at the end of our conference. So glad that you've all been here. It's been a pleasure to get to know some new faces and to reunite with olds and get to know some a little bit better than before. I'm very honored and pleased to be leading this last session, not because it's the last session, but because it is a topic very dear to me, is my identity. Scholar activism, or as in my field of peace and conflict studies, research practitioner. Titles, you think either one works, is how I operate in the world, and I'm very pleased that Paul Hedges will bring some reflections on that from across the globe and from a different, obviously, standpoint. So the title, or I should say the thematic title for the morning is Scholar Activism and Relations Between Traditions. Paul Hedges will be with us to share, and I'm going to read what I have of his bio because I don't have it memorized. Paul Hedges is Associate Professor in Interreligious Studies at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU, Singapore. Previously, he was Reader in Interreligious Studies at the University of Winchester in the UK and worked for other British, Canadian, and Chinese universities before that. Paul has worked with non-academic groups or institutions such as the Anglican Communion Network for Interfaith Concerns, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, the Babaji Yogi Sangam, the Dialogue Society, the World Congress of Faiths, and the BBC. He's on the editorial board of both the Journal of Religious History and Studies and Studies in Interreligious Dialogue. His research projects include interreligious relations in Singapore and the East and Southeast Asian region, as well as interreligious and intercultural hermeneutics. And I'm not sure how well or unwell those fit with this topic today, but in any case, I'm sure you will inform us. And I'm very pleased to introduce and welcome you to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julianne. Of course, I'm delighted to be here. I've been at every ESITIS conference since 2009, except the Bonn one when COVID still stopped me from getting here. What I'd like to sort of talk to you about this morning is a title of the scholar activist as Educator Amidst Religious and Non-Religious Diversity. I'm afraid I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to simply talk at you for the next half an hour or so, but hopefully you can cope with that. So to start with a bit of a preamble. I would like to thank the ESITIS board for considering me a suitable last-minute fall guy to step into a keynote position. Not only does it help me reflect that I was not their first choice, but they also think I write my conference papers on the fly at the last minute. This might be true sometimes, of course, but at least this means, in this case, if there's any errors or mishaps in my paper, I can blame it on the late request. So today, I would like to discuss the way that education itself may be a form of activism, or how we are engaged as practitioners in the classroom, our writing and research. My thoughts are inspired directly by two articles, one by the Latinx criminologist Xavier Perez, the other by the educationalist Michael Apple. Each of these authors, Perez and Apple, addresses their role as a scholar activist, the former including his journey from a prison cell to the university, the latter outlining what he sees as the task of the scholar activist as public intellectual in today's neoliberal climate, which has a great influence in defining society, culture, and the self, or disciplining, in a Foucauldian sense, our ways of being. I will also mention the work of Paulo Freire, who's been a great influence over my thought for many years. So I will address education, and especially interreligious education, as a form of resistance to hegemony and as a potentially emancipatory in its aims and outcomes. Perhaps if you had hoped to hear about how the scholar may be involved in direct action on the streets or in protest movements, you might be disappointed. But of course there are many examples. The firebrand Black American scholar Cornel West in the civil rights movement, and more recently in BLM, is one example, while the British feminist Catholic Tina Beattie is a public intellectual campaign against patriarchy and for women's equalities into churches. So there are examples of this. But rather, I will address the way that how we teach, engage our students and write is always political, and so must be a form of activism. Educating for. In Catherine Walsh and Walter Mignolo's co-authored book entitled On Decoloniality, Concepts, Analytics, Praxis, Walsh discusses the for, that is F-O-R, in which she seeks to define decolonisation as not simply a negative venture, that is to say, beyond being an anti-colonial discourse that resists and pushes back against forms of Western colonialism, to ask what it is for as a positive path of praxis. For her, this very simple three-lettered word goes beyond being simply a preposition or a conjunction and becomes an analytical tool. It helps us think about purpose and meaning. Also, intriguingly, within On Decoloniality, Walsh and Mignolo begin with praxis, that is to say, asking what we do and how we act before they address theoria, what concepts and ideas would guide us. This, Walsh describes itself as a form of decolonial praxis, an act of resistance against Western hegemonic forms, in that, instead of looking first to the logos, the ideas on which we base our lives, they look to the lived experience, and this itself is the source of theory, so praxis precedes theoria. This, of course, is not new. It has precedents within Latin American liberation theology and its modes of doing, and again, in the liberationist scholar of interreligious dialogue, Paul Nitter, he sees the dialogue of action as he puts it, having a certain priority before we start doing the more theological and theoretical work. So I begin here with the scholar activist as engaged in a liberating pedagogy with the question from Walsh of the decolonial for in asking about the for of scholar activist education. A dominant paradigm, which it can be hard to think against within the current marketisation of the university, within the colonial modes of performance that define the educational system, is that we should make students who are job ready. In other words, our degrees in teaching should be practical, alert to the marketplace and its needs, and to make our students employable. Employability skills, while not quite such an en vogue term today, has been a very dominant trope for quite some time. This, it may seem, would surely be part of the for of a scholar activist pedagogy, because a degree which leaves our students without practical skills could serve a certain elite who treat university as an intellectual finishing school before going forth into a world ordained for them with jobs ready-made. Students who come as first generation into higher education, as I myself did with money from my parents going to university, or from working class and less privileged backgrounds, need, it seems, to be job ready, unless we do them a disservice. Yet, is our job nothing but to create cogs for the machine, to fulfil the demands of the world and the market in providing willing and able pawns for the industrial, military, capitalist complex that dictates what the world needs, to support, in the words of Mignolo and Walsh, the capitalist death project, which, and here they quote from the Zapatista conception, that capitalism itself is war against all of humanity, against all of the planet. The educating for of the scholar activist pedagogical approach is, I must suggest, therefore, resistance. If we do not train our students how to question and think about the world, then a disservice is done to them. Another cry of the current times is the need to equip our students with critical thinking skills such that they can be adaptable. To make students ready with the skills and knowledge for just one job, we are told, in a fast-paced world, will not make them adaptable and ready to change into what the future holds for us. And there are different ways this can be met, and herein, I think, we see the seeds of resistance in the emporia, in the defences of the neoliberal educational machine. To use biblical language, our aim is to make students who are in the world, but not of the world. Interreligious studies as a discipline possesses, I would argue, these tools as an essentially critical discipline. It does not take the world and its religious differences, borders and divisions as normal or natural. It asks questions. Some of these are genealogical in nature. And within the constructed character of what we mean by religion, we see this archaeology of knowledge which we must give our students. The world and its taken for granted characteristics are neither normal nor natural. Neither religion nor the secular talk about an obvious or natural state of affairs. They're constructed social categories, as are our communities, our political communities, our nations, our in-groups, our out-groups. None of these are fixed and static. Rather, all are, to follow Benedict Anderson's phraseology, imagined communities. Once we recognise that something as fundamental as religion is not quite what we thought, I suggest a lot more becomes open to question. Some pedagogical aims. Students need to understand how power operates in knowledge, and so what we may term a discourse analysis approach underlays the work that we may do within teaching interreligious studies as a critical scholar-activist pedagogy. To name scholarly disciplines or tools, such things as social constructionism and deconstruction, besides discourse analysis, equip students to be able to think and challenge power, or to keep up with the liberation theology mode of discourse, to speak truth to power. As with the term religion, the world is not as it seems. Understanding patterns of human making will involve understanding the ways that our identities are formed in groups, with social identity theory and prejudice theory providing tools for what Rogers Brubaker termed groupism that haunts our thinking, while we need to understand how this in-group and out-group dynamic works. In one sense, these are critical tools of thinking that allow our students to be alert to the constructed and changing face of the worlds and the market. They can use them to dig below the surface, and they're also inherently critical and resistant to the discourses of the market itself. In a short but insightful book entitled Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative?, the British cultural theorist and radical political philosopher Mark Fisher analyses the way that the modern neoliberal market seems to have absorbed our entire whole worldview into itself, including into the systems of the modern university and education, such that, as his subtitle asks, is there no alternative? But the tools I've mentioned, and some of these seen in Fisher's book, are ways to question those norms, is taken for grantedness and the naturalness of all categories. After all, as I've mentioned, if there's no such thing as religion itself, then what else doesn't exist? Capitalism itself also becomes open to question and deconstruction. And indeed, we can even think of capitalism as a religion. It has its own priests, the economists, who conduct their various rituals, and they have dogmas, such as the power of the market, which is an unseen, invisible force, which, if we allow it to operate, will supposedly to ensure that everything in the world runs smoothly and in correct order. And quite like religious belief, of course, this flies in the face of empirical evidence, so you need a lot of faith to believe in market forces. Teaching, then, is itself a political act. We may teach our students to be job-ready, itself a political choice, when we follow the norms of our age. We may even continue to teach them religion in classical ways, letting our students delve into arcane languages and texts as an end in itself, so that they come out with their Greek and Latin, their Sanskrit, Arabic and Pali as cultured elites, who can tell you about debates in such things as 4th century commentarial traditions, but have no idea how to think about the world that we live in. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that we don't teach our students languages or history or textual hermeneutics. All of these are very useful, but any such teaching must be placed within a curriculum that is critical and resists. As various political thinkers have noted, to not resist the status quo or to not challenge oppression is to be complicit with it. How and what we teach is a political choice. Likewise, an interreligious studies pedagogy that stresses only social cohesion or social harmony will itself be complicit. We can create puppets who know how to smooth over difficulties and make sure that no one rocks the boat, which essentially is to create a world in which neoliberalism can continue to call the shots and the market can operate undisturbed. Interreligious studies, as much as any traditional course or way of thinking within religion, theology or elsewhere, can simply be a theory or practice that aligns with hegemonic power discourses. Again, to clarify, I'm not saying that social cohesion work is unimportant. It's part of what I'm paid to do in Singapore, and I'm actively engaged with it. But to take a bit of an aside across the wider sort of Southeast and East Asian region, there's a particular focus on the notion of harmony. It is, of course, a venerable concept in Chinese philosophy, the notion of he, which is often translated as harmony, or broadly to Tai Ping, the great peace, has at least 2,000 years of intellectual heritage as a philosophical and as a political concept. It has many positive connotations when we speak of harmony, that all live in peace without threat of violence, that broad coexistence and acceptance exists between all. Yet, such idealized concepts belie the pragmatic fact that such harmony generally means accepting somebody's peace on their terms. The elite will favour harmony where voices are not raised against the status quo. Dissent is seen as being out of kilter, and with the very real actuality that peace rests upon coercion, that those who are subalterns who seek to question this become seen as troublemakers, such that peace and harmony justify very often extremes of violence. From colonial control to police states to authoritarian regimes to today's regimes which claim to be liberal democratic ones, we see this taking place. Harmony may be an ideal for those in control as part of a discourse of suppression. Hence, we must remember what our teaching is for, stressing this decolonial for from Walsh and Mignolo, that our teaching, and I repeat, is political. It always is, and only ever can be. It should be one that foregrounds justice and resistance. Critical skills can serve various ends. At the ESITIS conference in Munster in 2017, I also delivered a paper on the scholar activist, that time justifying the concept, and since then a lot has been written around this. And in that paper, I considered various forms of what is often termed critical religion, and pointed out that despite its critique of religion from a genealogical stance, and claims by at least some associated with it to have a decolonial lens in doing this, it could, as I point out in various ways, align with alt-right and authoritarian impulses. As a critique has also pointed to the way that a white domination of theory exists within the study of theology and religion. A particular book is Christopher Driscoll and Monica Miller's Method as Identity, Manufacturing Distance in the Academic Study of Religion, which speaks about this across religious studies broadly. While Willie James Jennings, who actually I think our earlier speakers mentioned, as a black American liberation theologian, has written powerfully and persuasively on the notion of white masculinist self-sufficiency as a mode of being in theological education, but I think it has wider resonance. That methods such as critical theory, discourse analysis, deconstruction and social construction have their roots in political and justice-based concerns, I think, is something that can be taken for granted. But as that paper and others have argued, this can be downplayed, ignored, or disparaged, and certainly the study of religion, and sometimes theology, this is often the case, as my previous Munster paper argued. Indeed, they may serve non-progressive interests rather than liberatory ones. But I would suggest that these methods, as I've mentioned, have an inherently liberatory praxis within them. They show that the world might be thought otherwise. The ruling and dominant modes of being and knowing are not the only ones, and like everything else, have an origin and a history, and support certain ways of living, being, doing, and thinking. I would argue that such a way of teaching interreligious studies that may resist domination, norms, already has some guiding principles and texts. At the risk of self-promotion, I would suggest that my own textbook, Understanding Religion, Theories and Methods for Studying Religiously Diverse Societies, provides a model for such a pedagogy, with the skills, theories and methods embedded within it. As such, in terms of praxis, I think something of a pathway is pointed to, at least. Now, following Walsh and Mignolo, I turned from praxis and the question of the for to some theorising and to conceptual work that may underlie our work as scholar activists in doing education for social justice. However, I will draw here from praxis as much as simple theory to ask about the basis for activism, or, if you like, I will theorise in a sense of Freirean praxis. Education as activism. The British Jamaican cultural theorist Stuart Hall developed for us the concept of representation. While, classically, we may consider to represent something as to show what it is, Hall talked about systems of representation, because to represent is not simply to point at a thing, to isolate it, to show that thing itself, but rather we have a mental image which only exists in relation to other mental images, a whole map within the mind that delineates a worldview or way of seeing things in the world. To represent what education is, including education as critical activism, and we may note that Apple defined Hall as a model critical scholar activist, we need therefore to see a whole, to develop a wider map in which we place it. It is to have a vision of the world. Yet, if Hall represents for us the critical scholar activist, Apple also reminds us that we simply cannot go to one or two of his books to understand his vision. Rather, he notes Hall was an essayist, and the essay is a form of intervention which exists in a particular time, location, and in relation to a certain state of affairs. The essay is provisional and subject to adaptation. As our theories and understanding evolves, it does not prescribe what is or what should be, but places us only and ever and always in context. The representation that I wish to offer here of pedagogy as scholar activism is therefore a Hallian one in this sense. It is provisional and contextual, and this, I believe, is inherent within a critical interreligious studies approach. It recognises our locatedness as scholars, as agents. From the former ESITIS president and Norwegian scholar activist Oddbjørn Lervik has termed the spaces between, following Homi Bhabha's notion of third space, with interreligious studies recognising that scholars and students, as much as politicians or the media, are not divorced from society. We're all complicit in constructing its terms of reference. There is no neutral point above the fray of discourse. Interreligious studies scholars should, of course, know this. And of course, here I should also include intercultural theologians, that they too, perhaps even more so, recognise that all theology, but equally all theory, all ways of thinking, is only ever and always contextual, located, placed, conditioned, provisional, and localised. This is not to say that the local and contextual cannot have some universal validity, but that is a question for another paper. And actually, before I got asked to do this keynote, I was actually writing part of that paper, which is what I would have presented here until I was doing this. So there are some ideas on that elsewhere. Now, for the remainder of this paper, I will draw upon the three thinkers I mentioned earlier, so Michael Apple, Xavier Perez, and Paulo Freire, to help flesh out some principles for critical liberationist scholar activist pedagogical strategy, that while drawing from a particular location and context, a place in time, I hope will resonate in some meaningful ways with others. Michael Apple is an American educational theorist who has been a key thinker around the concept of the scholar activist for several decades, his first work back to the 80s. But the critical scholar activist is his particular sort of wording. And he has noted that there's an old debate as to whether education can actually participate in social change or whether it just simply functions to reproduce inequalities. And this, he suggests, is not a simple question that could be answered with a yes or a no, but he says is one of the most vexed issues in social, political, and cultural analysis, bound up with questions of how we conceptualize social transformation, what dynamics we need to consider, which groups may be agents of change, what is society, and many others. And in line with what I've outlined above, Apple notes the following, and I quote, "Rather than simply asking whether students have mastered a particular subject matter and have done well, we should ask a different set of questions. Whose knowledge is this? How did it become official? What is the relationship between this knowledge and how it is organised and taught? And who has cultural, social, and economic capital in this society? Who benefits from these definitions of legitimate knowledge and who does not? What can we do as critical educators and activists to change existing educational and social inequalities and to create curricula and teaching that are more socially just?" End quote. He further sets out 9 tasks for the critical scholar activist, noting that no one person can engage all of these equally well simultaneously. I will not list his 9 points here, but draw on a few of them that will help with the current argument. So he asks us to be ready to think about broadening what counts as research, which I don't speak about later, but perhaps is an issue we need to think about. But he also notes, with reference to Gramsci, that a truly counter-hegemonic education of committed cultural workers will not throw out the elite knowledge, but will reconstruct it to serve genuinely progressive social needs. And this, for me, brings to mind W.B. Du Bois's concept that we must employ the most evidential scientific sort of research, not finding what suits our political purposes, but following the evidence wherever it needs. And this accords with another of Appel's points, that in progressive politics, our aim is not simply to keep traditional critiques alive, but to ask how we should deal with current realities, which may require the relearning or redevelopment of new skills, and I suggest also new theories. And Appel also points to scholars using their privilege as experts who can exert, to at least some degree, their authority in the intellectual and public spaces, which may include policy and beyond. But Appel also notes the way that certainly his own more critical work has been resisted by neoliberal regimes, including cancelling speaking arrangements to share with school leaders and others his ideas on this, so there's resistance to this. And a final note from Appel is that he makes a case for the scholar activist as a mentor or model in their research, teaching and activism. And I will return to this again, but first I'm going to turn to Paulo Freire. Now, Freirean pedagogy, developed by and from the theories of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, hardly needs an introduction. It's been foundational for progressive pedagogy ever since his seminal Pedagogy of the Oppressed was first published in 1968 in Spanish, then in English in 1970. And an intriguing article by Alexandre Guilherme and John Morgan that compares Buber, Freire and Guseyev as educational theorists. They link Buber's concept of build a teacher with Freire's problem-solving or dialogical education, noting that education must build towards cultivating moral character rather than simply being about imparting information, Freire's banking model paradigm, if you're familiar with this. But where Freire develops his thought, particularly an extension from Buber, is in making it political. And we see this particularly in Freire's notion of conscientiousization, or raising awareness of people's situation, their oppression and suppression, especially against an education system that seeks to domesticate them within a particular system of power and discourse. But also importantly, Freire notes how the student-teacher relationship is one in which the teacher must also learn from the student in their current situation, with their concerns, their problems, and their own concepts. And this, I think, resonates with Appel's notion that being a teacher is not simply imparting what we think is presumed to be correct, but to learn new skills and theories to reflect the current realities of the world and our students and those around us. Of course, a lot more could be said about Freire and his pedagogy, but I'll turn now here to Perez. Xavier Perez is an American Latinx criminologist, and he's reflected on his own trajectory as a gang member in Chicago, which led him into jail, where he entered back into the educational system which he had dropped out of during school. And this, in due course, led him not only to university, but to becoming a professor of criminology himself. And his own pathway has led him to recognizing that he could be a conduit between higher education and disadvantaged young Latinos who may, like himself, be involved in criminality and gang membership, and also to have concerns with the way that the criminal justice system itself is devised and organized. Now, Pierre's sense of calling to being a scholar activist comes out of this route to higher education, and indeed, of course, it is not unique. But for others, it's not so much a calling as something they are called upon to do. And the American Muslim scholar of religion Najib Saeed and the British Sikh sociologist Jasjit Singh have both found themselves becoming, in some senses, spokespeople for their communities because these communities need a voice, and this becomes imposed upon them as the public figures from their communities. And this brings me to the question of the intersectionality of identities, because nobody is ever simply just a scholar. Also, some white, male, Western secular scholars seem to think that they can exist in a verified, non-foundational place that removes them from any position of advocacy, activism, or otherwise. Jennings' concept I mentioned of white masculinist self-sufficiency speaks to this and is as much a part of secular religious studies scholarship as it is of theological education. For some scholars, not to be an activist is impossible. And I think perhaps one of the most powerful examples is the example again of Du Bois, who, having just received his PhD from Harvard, was beginning his education as a scholar. But then the news in 1899 of the lynching of a young black man, Sam Hose, led him to question his vocation. What am I doing here? What effect does this have? And essentially leading him to becoming a public intellectual in the years following that. Now, let me consider some other facets of what Perez has to tell us. Part of this picks up examples of his own treatment, for he notes that when he started university, his white classmates used to assume I was a gang member and would often share snide comments. But, moreover, he tells us, the professors, to his dismay, made no attempt to correct their behaviour. We may reference back to Apple's comment about mentors, because Perez notes that his decision to continue in education was partly down to a single white professor who actually recognised him as having a potential as a Latinx scholar. Now, obviously, we would abhor the attitude of Perez's other professors, and the language of interreligious dialogue might lead us to think about how we make our classrooms and wider universities safe spaces. But while we perhaps might be personally appalled by Perez and his experience and think it has no part of our practice, in many parts around the world, there is evidence that racism is reinforced and normalised on university campuses. Hegemonic dominance of neoliberal sort of education results in certain things being taught and sort of prioritised. And of course, people lose their jobs for speaking out against this. And as one piece of research has noted, and I quote, it's dangerous to be a scholar activist these days. It is sometimes problematic to resist. Much that Perez relates is not theory-led, but about how his experiences shape his pedagogy, such that when he developed a new programme at DePaul University for a curriculum that questioned the racist and often retributive nature of our criminal justice system by offering holistic solutions to crime in society, he also saw a need to change the perception of prisons, not just amongst prisoners themselves, but in the wider population. As such, his work speaks pragmatically about the concerns that I've been raising here, about how we educate everyone around us on these issues. And that's one particular context of it. But of course, I said this goes beyond simply the classroom, and as people in universities, and we've noticed some of their peculiarities during this conference, so the meetings, the corridors, the libraries, the public spaces all be places where, if you like, a scholar activist as an educator needs to be a presence. And Perez's experience also leads me to return to Freire, that an issue is not just to focus on affecting social and political change, but must also concern the individual and their development. As Freire states in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to struggle for a free society is not a struggle for a free society unless through it an even greater degree of individual freedom is created. Hence, as educators, we must bear in mind both the structural situation we must resist and that also we work in, but also the very real issue that we face individuals in their own particular context and that we need to give freedom to each individual, whatsoever that may mean for them in their own terms of their journey, and to empower every student, to use another trendy buzzword. Towards a conclusion, when we speak of the scholar activist, we often imagine that it concerns the scholar in another role, not as the researcher or teacher, but out into public space as a social advocate on the sort of front lines. But I've argued here that a critical scholar activist must also be considered teaching as a rightful place of activism. While some scholars have suggested that a scholar activist is only really a scholar activist when they engage beyond academia in the world, others have suggested that scholar activism must occur within the classroom and the wider university bounds as well. Now, some of us may naturally back away from this, the idea of being an activist in the classroom. We may say it's not our role in the classroom to be an advocate, to tell students what to think, to direct our teaching towards an end that will induce our students to one position, especially political positions over any other. But such a pedagogical activity is not what I'm advocating. If I may quote from a summation of what Freire tells us, or a summary of sort of Freire tells us about interreligious education. For Freire, the only authentic aim of education was to liberate. As such, he claimed that educators had no right to prescribe, limit, or impose particular belief opinions on others. He equated such prescription with manipulation and domination. Rather, the question is for education to be truly critical. That is to say, we need to equip students with the skills and attitudes to question, to exercise a hermeneutic of suspicion, if you will. We should be transparent what our education is for, whose rules, whose norms, whose presuppositions underlay the learning process, and how assessment also fits into this. This is to say, we can help them realise that the social justice agenda is one which highlights the inequality which exists within the systems we live in, and the different forms of education may highlight or hide these structural, moral, and political questions. A supposedly neutral education that makes them work ready is anything but a neutral education, and our students need to know this. What they do with that, of course, is their own concern. But equally, in a Freyerian sense, I would not want to prescribe what the role or nature of the scholar activist as education should be. Each of us works in very different contexts. There are institutional constraints, confessional constraints, legal constraints, curricular constraints, and other matters which will be different for each of us. Walsh notes that knowledge is incarnated and situated, something that the university too often forgets. And in reflection on scholarship, I'll enter a couple of quotes here. In an AAR presidential address, Emily Town suggested that, and I quote, "We need to tarry a bit before we attempt to be rational, critical, analytical, precise and vigorous in our scholarship and teaching," while the American sociologist Jesse Daniels asks us to ask ourselves about our teaching with any social justice concern, why are you doing this work? So this work of reflexivity needs careful deliberation. If, as I have argued, we take it seriously that teaching and research can also be scholar activism in a full and meaningful way, then what are we doing and why are we doing it? Our teaching is political, however we regard it, so let us endeavour to ensure it offers an emancipatory hope of liberation for our students. Thank you.